Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to another edition of our St. Anthony sessions on justice. We began last fall, and in particular, we began in response to the issues of injustice in our society and in our community, and certainly after the very shocking killing of George Floyd. We really felt like we had a responsibility as a community of faith to explore issues of justice in society, and particularly when possible through Christian teaching, through biblical justice, and through our understanding of what the requirements of justice are. And we had a number of wonderful sessions this past fall that were really enlightening, including a panel of Lourdes parishioners, parishioners of color, who were very, very thoughtful in sharing their experiences. We had Dr. Yohuru Williams, who gave a fantastic talk last fall. And then recently, we heard from our parishioner Sergio Barrera, who is completing his doctorate in economics at the University of Minnesota and had been invited to take place in Pope Francis's, they're calling it his economy of inclusion. And that was a Vatican-sponsored conference that brought together young economists from all over the world. And so that was a wonderful session. We also had Monsignor Chad Guion, who is the pastor of the Indian Mission at Standing Rock in North Dakota, and a friend of mine, and it was a wonderful conversation. We're really delighted to have Professor Mark Osler with us today. Mark is a colleague of mine at the St. Thomas School of Law. He is a professor and Robert and Marion Short Distinguished Chair in Law. And what I'll say before I get into some of the particulars of his bio, we have a terrific community at St. Thomas Law School of faculty, staff, of course our students as well, who are drawn to the unique mission. And we really have a talented staff. Mark is at the top of that heap. And the thing that really stands out to me as a colleague is the really potent combination of head and heart that Professor Osler brings to really what I would call a ministry, but also his advocacy and his work, particularly in the area of clemency. So Professor Mark Osler's work advocates for sentencing and clemency policies rooted in principles of human dignity. In 2016 and 2019, the graduating class chose him as Professor of the Year. He is an outstanding teacher in addition to an outstanding writer and advocate. In 2015, he won the Dean's Award for Outstanding Scholarship, and in 2013, he received the Outstanding Teaching Award. Osler's writing on clemency, sentencing, and narcotics policy has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and in law journals at Harvard, Stanford, and the University of Chicago. In addition, he's worked across a number of administrations. The Obama administration, the Trump administration. That is no easy feat in terms of working with those diverse ways of approaching issues of law and justice. And I would imagine, I think you reached out to the Biden administration, and certainly then candidate Biden as well. And so you're welcome to share some of that work as well. A former federal prosecutor, he played a role, Mark did, in striking down the mandatory 100-to-1 ratio between crack and powder cocaine in the federal sentencing guidelines by winning the case of Spears versus the United States in the Supreme Court, with the court ruling that judges could categorically reject that ratio. He's also written a book in 2009, Jesus on Death Row, critiquing the American death penalty through the lens of Jesus's trial. And so we are really delighted to have Professor Osler with us. He'll speak for about 35, 40 minutes, and you know, I said yesterday in an email, anything that he wants to share, including the Chauvin verdict, or certainly some of the particular work he's done in terms of clemency here in Minnesota that has been really inspiring, including working with St. Thomas Law students. He also has a commutations clinic that he runs at St. Thomas, that he directs at St. Thomas, and the students get a deep dive into how important that work is. We have our cell number, and Sarah Trask, I thank her. She is going to be sending me texts of questions that come in, and then I will pose them to Professor Osler when he concludes his remarks. Professor Osler was also with us a couple of years ago and gave a fantastic talk, and he's always very welcome here at Our Lady of Lourdes. So we welcome Professor Mark Osler.
Well, thank you so much for that, Father. And it's incredible to be back in this beautiful space. It's always inspiring to walk in here, and especially on a warm day. It's been an unusual time to be a criminal law professor in Minneapolis, of course. The eyes of the world have been here on our home, watching the Chauvin trial. I think many people will remember where they were when that verdict came back. And I was in my office, actually I was teaching, and I had a room full of first-year crim law students. And we were actually talking about the theory of retribution. And one of the students raised his hand and said, Professor Osler, I don't mean to interrupt you, but we all just got a text saying they're closing the building down because the verdict is coming back. So we shut down class, and I let everybody go, and I went back to my office. And my office is up on the 4th floor looking towards downtown over Nicollet Mall and Target headquarters. And I sat down. Of course, we had to wait a little while. NPR called, and they wanted reaction, and so I had the phone in my hand, and I'm looking out the window, and there was, I'm next to 11th Street, which leads out to 394, and the street was full of people, just jammed with cars, something I haven't seen since the pandemic began, frankly. People streaming out of downtown, trying to get out of town before the verdict came in. And there was just a cacophony. Helicopters overhead, the traffic, people were driving crazy. The students, of course, were trying to get out of the building. And then I'm watching on the screen, and Judge Cahill took the bench to read the verdict. And suddenly there was this quiet. It was so striking that the traffic went away. I saw a few cars that were still driving along LaSalle pull over to the side to listen to the verdict. The helicopters must have gone over to the courthouse. It was a remarkable moment, and then the verdict was read, and slowly things spooled back up and the world restarted. It was an important verdict. We live in a world that struggles with criminal justice, and it's an ancient struggle. People send me a lot of things with Micah 6:8 on it, and that's fine with me because I think it's a remarkable passage. And of course, it urges us to seek justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with our God. And I think about that a lot. And I think about that in moments like we face now, in that justice is a good. I think what we saw in that conviction was justice. Mercy is a good. Those two things are in tension with each other. They pull at one another. If we think of justice as treating people the same way, having that aspect of fairness, then mercy is often unfair in a way. And it's hard to reconcile those two things. But I think the key is the third part of that passage. It's about humility. That we must have within us the humility to know that we're not getting it right. That in seeking to have both justice and mercy, it takes humility. Because sometimes we have to acknowledge that what we're providing isn't what everyone will consider justice. And at other times, it's not what everyone would consider mercy. But I do know this, from that position of humility, that we are not doing things right if it's all justice or if it's all mercy. There has to be both. And when we get to one pole or the other, we're out of balance. And sometimes we've seen that. In our own history, we've gone through cycles of different ideas about criminal justice. And early in the 20th century and late in the 19th century, there was a movement towards rehabilitative justice, that the idea was that we could fix people. And this built on the ideas of the early psychologists, the psychiatrists, the social scientists, Max Weber in sociology, that people's minds and societies of humans were something we could study and understand the same way we did other sciences. And that meant we could change people. That's why we built correctional institutions, to correct people, reformatories, things that were built on the premise that if we incarcerated people, we could change them and renew them. Even the Quakers were involved in building prisons with that in mind. And of course, over the long term, we became disillusioned with that. In the 70s and 80s, crime rose, and the retributivist instinct to punish, to incapacitate, came to predominate in criminal law in the United States. That we saw a takeover of the criminal justice system from that urge that we all have to hurt people who have hurt us. It's a human instinct. It's something that certainly within our faith we struggle with, and as a society we struggle with. But for a while, we embraced it, and we codified it. We put it into our laws. Mandatory minimums that demanded that people serve long sentences, regardless of the particularities of their crime. The use of the death penalty rose, because that was the ultimate punishment. We saw sentences rise. We saw over-incarceration, what some call mass incarceration in this country. The federal system for a century held between 10 and 25,000 people. Suddenly it was over 200,000. And there was a cost to all this. There was a cost in that balance. There was a lack of humility, certainly, in what we did in that time. And part of what we gave up in that period was clemency at the federal level and in most of the states as well. Clemency is an ancient thing. It goes back to the Code of Hammurabi. And we know it's writ within our own sacred texts that we have right there in the middle of Holy Week, clemency. That Pilate, by the Jewish tradition, was going to let a prisoner go. And he ended up letting Barabbas go and keeping Jesus on the path towards human death. And there were other forms of clemency too that we see in the scriptures. I'm always taken by John 8 in a lot of ways, but one part of it is that there was an execution that was justified under the Mosaic law. And Jesus comes upon it and says, you don't have the moral authority to do this. That's striking. And it's not just our own faith and culture and society that has embraced clemency historically. Even the Romans embraced it. In fact, they embraced it to the degree that they tended to create gods that they believed reflected the virtues of the emperor. And they created a goddess that was based on the virtue of clemency that they saw in their leaders. Now, of course, clemency is used as a tool to maintain authority in ways that have an aspect of humanity in governance. But the goddess Clementia was a part of the Roman pantheon and often is featured on their coins. I actually, one of the things I carry around in my pocket is a coin with Clemencia's name on it, and a striking image as well. And it's something that millions of Roman citizens and others were walking around with the name Clemencia in their pockets. And it came into our own society that we get clemency via the British system, but it's very strange that it was adopted into our Constitution. Most of the states didn't have functioning clemency systems at that time, or the colonies didn't. And of course, it was a power of the king. It was the power of the king on his own, or a queen on her own, to release someone from a penalty. It was controversial in England even. And there was pushback from Parliament. There was odd uses. Mercy is at the center, the use of clemency even, of Shakespeare's work. Measure for Measure is a play about clemency. And of course, in The Tempest, in The Merchant of Venice, we have these themes that go to what's at the core of clemency. I think that had something to do with clemency ending up in our Constitution. We were at a low ebb for faith at the time that the framers came up with the Constitution, but they were influenced by Shakespeare. Jefferson and Adams went to Stratford-on-Avon on a pilgrimage to Shakespeare's home in his theater together. You had George Washington, during the Constitutional Convention, went to go see The Tempest performed in Philadelphia. That the Merchant of Venice was something that many of the framers had seen. They had a debate in the Constitutional Convention about whether or not to put clemency in that document. There was pushback. There was the consideration that it could be used corruptly, but they put it in with only a single limitation, that it couldn't be used when impeachment is ongoing. It's really striking that it's there too. That for me, and one reason that I've embraced clemency at the heart of what I try to do is that it's an intersection between my faith and the Constitution. The Constitution is a secular document, but right there in the middle is a value that resounds deeply and wholly within the faith that I practice. So it's a good place to go. And of course, the early Americans had to deal with it too. George Washington, first president, and everything's new. You think about it, he's got this Constitution he's dealing with, and no one's done these things before. What does it mean to be the commander-in-chief? He has to decide. What does it mean to have the power of the pardon? He has to decide. And the first time he used it was against the Whiskey Rebels. A little disclaimer here. The Whiskey Rebels, the farmers in western Pennsylvania who rebelled against the United States, those were my people. My family comes from that area at that time. So it was our fault. But what happened was they wanted to be able to transport whiskey to the east because the roads were terrible. They were cut off from using the Mississippi by Spain. And Alexander Hamilton had a taxing scheme that would have taxed whiskey in a way that grain wouldn't have been taxed, favoring eastern farmers over the western farmers. So it was a tax issue. They tar and feather a tax collector. They killed a federal official. It was a real rebellion, and George Washington had to deal with it. And taking that role of commander-in-chief very seriously, he led the army on a white horse with Hamilton on one side and the governor of Pennsylvania on the other, with 13,000 militiamen behind him. I've often thought that we would have a lot less war if we'd stayed with that tradition, that the president goes first. But my people of western Pennsylvania folded immediately before they even got close to having a conflict. And so now there was the question of what to do with these rebels. The leaders were sentenced to death. And the first use of clemency was George Washington pardoning them out of the sentence of death, which is remarkable. And that's the legacy that we have going forward, that is not just for mercy, but sometimes for unexpected mercy. There was a man named Oscar Collazo, a Puerto Rican nationalist, who tried to murder Harry Truman when he was staying at Blair House while the White House was under construction. Well, Truman watched the attempt from a balcony. A security guard was killed. He was sentenced to death. And Harry Truman pardoned from the death sentence, commuted the death sentence of the man who was trying to kill him. Very different than some of the self-centered clemencies that we've seen more recently. You know, the system of clemency that we have is too complicated. It's bureaucratic. And one of the, mentioned before that in the 80s and 90s, as things became more retributivist in our nation, clemency also contracted. And what happened was bureaucracy. When my clinic, when we prepare a clemency petition now, we send it to the pardon attorney, and a staff person at the pardon attorney will review it, reach out to the local prosecutors, come up with an opinion, send that along to the pardon attorney, who then reviews it and decides what they should do from there. And after that, it goes to a staffer at the Deputy Attorney General within the Department of Justice, and then the Deputy Attorney General. So we're 4 steps along, one after the other, and we're just still in the Department of Justice. Then it goes to a staffer at the White House Counsel who reviews it, makes a recommendation to the White House Counsel. And only in the 7th step does it go to the President. So we've been trying to change that. And Father Dan talked about the efforts we've made, first with the Obama White House, then with the Trump White House, and now with the Biden White House, to change that process, because process creates outcomes as much as will. And that does have to change. Now, in our own state, we have a clemency system that is almost as unwieldy, but for a different reason. That in Minnesota, what we struggle with is a constitutional requirement that says that the pardon board consists of the governor, the attorney general, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, these are busy people. Now, there's a statute that says, well, the Constitution says that the governor shall have the power to pardon, although it creates this pardon board as well. And the problem is that we have a statute that says that there's a veto that each member of the pardon board has. And that means that if any one of them doesn't like the clemency, they can spike it. We have maybe the most interesting pardon hearings in America. They're striking. I started going when I moved here, and I go every time they have them. People who want a pardon appear personally, almost always without a lawyer. And sitting in a dais in front of them is the governor, the attorney general, the chief justice. How intimidating is that? And then they have to plead their case. And because of open meeting laws, the 3 officials talk about the case while the person's standing there, and then rule on the fly whether or not they'll get the pardon. Now, because of the uniformity rule, we have one of the lowest rates of clemency in the United States. People sometimes imagine there's a red-blue divide, that conservative states would do less clemency than more progressive states, and it's actually the opposite. The states that do the most clemency are South Carolina, Arkansas, Georgia, Delaware. And it's because they have better processes as well as a will. When he was governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee did a lot of clemency, and a lot of it was inspired by faith. Meanwhile, Vermont and Minnesota, we don't do so much. Now, something else happened on Tuesday of last week besides the Chauvin verdict coming back, and that is that a judge in Ramsey County, at the urging of the students in my clinic and a law firm that worked with us, struck down the clemency system as unconstitutional. And that opens up a new avenue that we're going to have to reframe the way it's done here. There's legislation that could fix it. The practices of the pardon board could fix it. But we're likely to see a wider route towards mercy in Minnesota than we have in the past, and that's a good thing. You know, mercy and retribution, that balance, it is at the deepest part of our hearts, I think. And there's sometimes cases that come up that bring out how important that is. There's been a line of cases involving people who committed crimes when they were juveniles, when they were children, and receiving either the death penalty or life without parole for those crimes. The Supreme Court held that the death penalty couldn't be used for people who committed their crimes as juveniles. And then they held that life without parole wasn't appropriate for people who committed crimes other than homicide. And then they applied that to homicide. And so the theory behind that the majority of the Supreme Court embraced, and the advocate for this in the Supreme Court was Bryan Stevenson. I know some of you probably have read his book, Just Mercy. And he was the person who walked into the Supreme Court and convinced the justices of this, that children change. That when we look at a 16-year-old, we're not looking at the person who will be around at age 50 probably. That the chance for rehabilitation, for restoration, is greater with children, not lesser. And that was a big change. Not just, it didn't affect a lot of cases, but affected the moral core of criminal justice in a profound way, because it introduced this aspect of we can believe in change. Something that as people of faith, I think we're compelled to see, the hope for redemption in even those who have erred terribly. Now there's a case that came down last week that's really discouraging. Came out of Mississippi. A 15-year-old boy named Brett Jones was a troubled kid. And it's not surprising he was troubled. He was from a ferociously abusive home. He had a father who beat him terribly. The father left. A stepfather came in who was even worse. And when he was about 14, about to turn 15, they threw him out of the house. So he went to live with his grandparents. And he was about 23 days past his 15th birthday when he was at his grandparents' house. And he had a girl over. He had a girlfriend. She came and spent the night. The grandfather found out. And the 15-year-old was chopping things in the kitchen. And the grandfather came and confronted him about it. Grandfather shoved him. They had a fight. And the child stabbed his grandfather and killed him. A deep tragedy. A judge in Mississippi sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole, and determined that he was incorrigible. And the Supreme Court upheld that last week, that was a sentence that was justifiable. It's troubling. It's off balance, and it lacks humility, because if there is an arrogance within the law, it comes to the fore in moments like that, when someone thinks they can look at a 15-year-old and judge that person for the rest of their life, their dangerousness. We come from faiths that believe otherwise. And surprisingly, the Supreme Court judges who ruled that way do too. Of course, there's complexity of the law, nuances. But as a society, as we move forward, that role for mercy, that role for the possibility of redemption has to be there. And if it's not, then we're suffering from that type of arrogance that always takes us in the wrong direction, towards needless harm. One of the things I tell my students every class, every year, about criminal law is that it's all tragedy. Every bit of it. Derek Chauvin was convicted. It does not unmurder George Floyd. It doesn't untraumatize the people who watched. We can't remove the tragedy through punishment, through retribution. The only way we heal is through something other than that. And that's where our eyes need to turn as we move forward. So, I think 6 o'clock on the dot. So, do we have questions?
We have some questions,
Great.
and I'll come this way, although I can just be on audio as well. Just a comment, Mark, about that case. I was deeply disappointed by that Supreme Court case, and it doing the work in the restorative justice area, and the idea that this person would never have the opportunity to really be rehabilitated, and we know the nuances in terms of there's originalism, and so this idea that people we can develop our sense of what violates the Eighth Amendment over time. That's a deeply kind of debated concept. But what happens, and I liked your phrasing of the arrogance, because what happens is that kind of approach to constitutional interpretation or law ends up being the tail that wags the dog. And I think of John Noonan and his person-centered approach to law. It doesn't allow us to see law as it relates to human beings, and some sort of construct or approach, while well-meaning and well-argued, ends up being the thing that wins the day. And the other thing I would just note in that case is most of that group were Catholics. And the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, in a good document a number of years ago, really talked about approaching criminal justice through this lens of rehabilitation, putting mercy in tension with justice. And I'm disappointed. Of course, they all say that can't influence them, and I understand that. But I hope for better results. We did get a question asking if you could share a couple of inspiring stories about the work that your students have done in the commutations clinic, and anything that might be inspiring to the folks.
Yeah, that's something I am glad to have the chance to talk about, because we have remarkable students, and I'd like to say that I guide them towards doing these things, but sometimes I don't. They just go ahead and do it. But just a word about what my clinic is, that in the year 2000, I was teaching at Baylor. Got tenure there. It was a fine place. I was the Wacoan of the year in 2009, in fact. And I came up here to give a faculty colloquium where I was just giving a lecture to the faculty. And I was getting a ride back to the airport, and the dean at that time said, we need a crim law professor. Have you ever thought about leaving Baylor? And I said, I don't know. And he said, is there anything you'd want to do that you don't get to do? And I said, well, I'd love to have a clinic. I'm not a clinical professor, but I'd love to have a clinic to do clemency with my students. And he said, right away, we could do that. That fits in with our mission. So here I am, and the clinic has been remarkable. So every year I take 6 to 8 students, and we go through my mail, because prisoners write to me. And they send these big brown envelopes, usually with too many stamps on them. I always count the stamps, 10 stamps. A prisoner works about 1 hour to earn what we pay for a stamp. So just to send that envelope to me, just the postage, is 10 hours of working in the factory in the prison. So we go through the mail, and we talk about these people's stories, and then we reach out to them. We come to a consensus about who we're going to represent. And I send the students to the prisons. I know for me it's a transformative thing to visit those in prison. And for the students it is as well. I require that they spend 2 days in the prison. And I also require that they figure out how to get into the prison, which sometimes is more difficult than getting out, I think. There's the paperwork is always confusing and changes on a whim. So they go into the prison, they spend 2 days, and they come back, and they're different. And it's a wonderful thing. Between the clinic that I have here and a project we had with NYU, during the Obama era, we've gotten over 100 people out. And they call me. We talk to them. They call the students that worked with them. And sometimes the students do things that are completely outside the bounds of what I expect. And that happened this year, twice, actually. And once was, I mentioned that we got this good ruling. Well, they wrote an amicus brief and did the research for an amicus brief because they wanted to have input. But the other thing that happened is that right now, the state clemency proceedings that I was talking about before, they're online. And so anybody can tune in the live stream and watch it. The next one's towards the end of June. You can go to the Minnesota Pardon Board and look up the live stream yourself and watch the next one. But we had done a lot of work. I led a panel that investigated a case into a young man named Mayan Burrell. And we had made a recommendation in our report that he receive clemency. And he was up for clemency. So the students were watching the entire day of clemency hearings. But right before Mayan Burrell's case, there was another case, a low-profile case that nobody had paid attention to. A woman named Maria Elizondo. And Ms. Elizondo she was an immigrant. She had kids. She was poor. And she stole. She stole from stores. And she got caught. And she was ordered to pay restitution. She was ordered to pay fines. She was still poor. She raised her kids. She did her best. One of her children, I think more than one, entered the armed forces. And now she was threatened with deportation, in part because of the conviction hanging over her. So she wanted a pardon. She applied for a pardon. She did not do anything after that. She had a clean record. And so they had the hearing, and it was one of the short hearings. It was a low-profile case. Her case was made for her because her English was poor by her son, who's in the United States Army. I think he's in the National Guard. And he's about to be deployed. And part of what he said that I know really affected the governor, who of course spent much of his life in the National Guard, was, I'm about to be deployed overseas for a year in the National Guard. And I want to come home and know my mother will still be here, that she won't be deported out of the country, having raised me, having led me to this point where I can serve my country in this way, that she won't be deported. And it worked. Governor Walz was all in. Keith Ellison, the Attorney General, also was supportive of her case. But the Chief Justice, Lori Gilday, had a problem with it. And she said, I don't want to grant clemency to anyone who hasn't paid all of their fines and restitution. And there was some $15,000 that was still owing by Ms. Elizondo. Of course, there was interest in things that built up from the original amount that she'd stolen. And there was this heartbreaking conversation where the son got back in front of the camera and said, I'll give whatever I have. I think I have $6,000 and I can get a couple thousand more if I sell things. The Chief Justice said, well, no, I'm sorry that unless the whole thing's paid, I'm going to deny this. And as I said before, each member of the pardon board had the ability to spike it. And the governor and the Attorney General talked to the Chief Justice into giving Ms. Elizondo a week or two to see if she could raise the money. And then we moved on to the Burrell case, and of course it was very plugged into that. What I didn't know is that my students were so taken by Ms. Elizondo's story and by her son that they immediately started raising the money. They started a GoFundMe, and they worked the phones, and they raised the money in 24 hours. In fact, more money. And after the GoFundMe had raised enough money, there were people still wanting to give to this. It was a remarkable moment. And these were students who at that time, I believe they were in the middle of finals. And so they've got their finals going on. They have to watch this thing because I required them to. That was their final for my class. And what they're doing is raising the money for Maria Elizondo. They paid the fines, they paid the restitution, and a week later they had a special hearing and they voted to grant her the pardon. And it wasn't the biggest case in the world, or the one that was most notable, but I've never been more proud of my students. I didn't have anything to do with that. I didn't know they were doing it. I found out because Keith Ellison called me and said, "Hey, I think your students are going to get that money from Ms. Elizondo." And I thought I'd missed a couple messages from my students in the midst of everything, but pretty remarkable. And so, all those years ago when the dean said that I could have this clinic if I came here, it was the right choice.
That qualifies as an inspiring story.
I hope so.
This is what Dean Vischer said, and these get out there pretty far and wide, so I'm safe, I think. The dean sends out to the faculty and staff every week, and he has been doing it since COVID, really inspiring, very thoughtfully done emails. The staff might be saying, how come we don't get those from you, Father Dan? But in any event, and one of the things that I really appreciate about Dean Vischer is his ability as a leader to be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And he has been doing that. Part of his email to about 78 of us, faculty and staff, referring back to the mission awards that happened last Wednesday, and Professor Osler is the chair of that committee. There were many worthy award recipients who worked to advance justice in a wide variety of settings, but I want to call out one group of students in particular. Students in our commutations clinic were watching a hearing during which Marie Elizondo was denied a pardon and thus placed at risk of deportation because she could not pay $15,000 in restitution stemming from the use of false identification. The students, so this is repeating what Professor Osler said, the students were moved by her story, raised the money, and needed, in less than 24 hours, help to not their client. She had no connection to St. Thomas. In the midst of a very busy they stepped up to assist someone who could never repay them, provide professional networking opportunities, or help them satisfy graduation requirements. I was inspired reading that and hearing it again. Justice, it would seem like there are conflicting definitions of it from different philosophies, punitive, restorative. How do you reconcile these differences?
There's the word. And so when I'm talking about justice as being in tension with mercy, I think that when people, agnostics, atheists, very few Christians are on this walk with me, that are willing to take that path and have that be important. I mean, I've talked to a lot of other people to see if they get involved, and often the response I get is, well, we're focused on religious liberty right now. And I have a problem with that, frankly, that, when people talk about religious liberty, they often mean, sometimes they mean in a broad sense, defending the liberty of all Americans, of whatever their religion might be, or no religion at all. But very often that's code for, we're protecting our rights. This isn't a faith that's about rights. Jesus didn't go around and tell people, defend your rights. He went around telling people, give up your life. It's about sacrifice, not about demanding advantage. That we are a faith that is born in caves. When you read Acts, they're travelers who are going from place to place, being thrown out and shaking the dust off their feet. And it seems that this sense of protecting entitlement of rights is, every time I have that conversation where I talk to someone, particularly in the Christian legal world of education, and they say, well, right now we're focusing on religious liberty, I worry. And it's from across the Christian spectrum. But we need to when we think about what our vocation should be so centered on, people like Maria Elizondo are a better focus than ourselves, probably.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think what happens is it's a capitulation to the reduction of justice simply through rights language, and we often don't get to the duties. We emphasize rights, but then as Christians to understand that, as Pope Benedict said in a document, it would be a cold place if we stopped at justice, to go beyond that to love and mercy, and that is what was so evident in the early church. Just these, that's really what converted the Roman Empire. It wasn't the Edict of Milan, it was Christians living these extraordinary lives of mercy and love, within their communion and beyond their communion in a way that was moving. One other thing that I would like to ask you is this issue, and I referenced this on a call that some of us were on today, and some of our colleagues referenced it, is American culture. So we're an outlier in so many ways in terms of how many people we imprison in the use of the death penalty, and in other ways as well. Also the severity of our sentences. Where do you think that comes from? Where, when we look at American culture, is there something we can point to? You made, in taking us through the history, I think an instructive and helpful point that there was an attempt to foster more of a rehabilitative approach to folks who commit crime and are in prison, but then we focus very much on the more severe, and there's some inroads too in terms of, the Congress has done almost nothing in a bipartisan way in the last 4 or 5 years, and they actually did get some good work done, and there's more work to be done. But Mark, where do you see that culturally? Is there anything that you can point to that might give us a sense of where that is and where we can help transform that?
Yeah, I think part of it is that we haven't always been that way, Certainly there was frontier justice and things like that, but having a system of justice that's quite so retributive, that didn't happen until my lifetime here in the United States. So how did that happen? I think part of it is this, that if you go back in American history, we were often at war in the traditional sense. And of course, we were at war in Afghanistan for a long time, but it didn't affect anybody's life. And through the Cold War, we identified a foreign threat that unified us. But once the Cold War ended, that coincided with this move towards retribution. And I think that we found an enemy within, and it exacerbated the instincts that we already had that way. For example, a lot of American culture had regarded our black brothers and sisters as the enemy within, and racism certainly, presaged this entire thing. But it broadened at that point and intensified. We didn't have a foreign enemy anymore. We stood alone. And at that point, it was the drug dealers. It was, it was the murderers. It was this sense that Americans have of crime always going up is very strange, because over the past 25 years, it's consistently gone down. And even now, where we've seen a blip in some areas going up, we're at near historic lows for crime in the United States. And yet the cries for retribution continue. War and criminal justice have something in common, that they're seen by many as a justifiable use of the sword, that we hurt our enemies. And perhaps in the absence of war, of the traditional kind of war, we've filled in that space somehow with something else, and it's pernicious. And of course, once we go to war on ourselves, the victim is the unity of our society. And of course, there's been many things that have divided the society, but that's been one of them.
reminds me, I believe he's a theologian, he might be a philosopher, but his name is René Girard. And he did something really extraordinary, and this really resonates as I started thinking back through my life and in terms of American culture, because I think there is something, and I'm not blaming it on the fact that we're affected by original sin, but there is something in the human person to scapegoat, to blame. That and I think fear that often is underlying the sense of a threat even when it's not there, I think is part of all the reason more why we need, grace to lift us up. This has just been terrific. It's been really enlightening, we're all very appreciative. We have some people in the church and a number of people online. And we just thank you, and the doors are always open to you, Mark, at Lourdes, and just appreciate your work. And what I would ask our folks to do, if they would, is to keep Professor Osler and his students in your prayers, to pray for their continued success, to pray for their determination to keep leaning into this important work. And then I would say to pray that more Christians would be inspired to join this effort for mercy within our society, a society that so often lacks mercy. So we thank Professor Mark Osler today for being with us and wish him all the best as he completes the semester and continues his great work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just very briefly, we hope to have another session or two in May and June as we close out the season, and we'll be back at it. My hope is in September. I do want to thank the couple from Our Lady of Lourdes who has made the live stream and made this possible in terms of their generosity. So we thank them. And I thank Julie Craven for really getting the word out on Professor Osler's fine talk. This evening, the Justice and Charity Committee that does a great deal of wonderful work here at Our Lady of Lourdes. Thanks to Mary Asp, our administrator, who's here today. And lastly, and not in the least, thanks to Josh Zenner for doing such a terrific job with the live stream. So we'll see you here hopefully next month for another session of the St. Anthony Sessions on Justice. Have a great night and enjoy the weather.